and welcome to the ALCTS webinar, Assessment Strategies for Cataloging Managers. I'm Felicity Dicus, Chair of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I will be your host. Our presenter today is Rebecca Mugridge. Rebecca is Associate Director for Technical Services and Library Systems at the University of Albany, SUNY. She has held previous positions at Pennsylvania State, Yale, Robert Morris University, and the University of Pittsburgh. Her current professional interests include technical services assessment and demonstrating the impact of technical services activities. I've heard Rebecca speak before and know she brings a wealth of knowledge to today's topic. It is a real pleasure to have her with us. Here are a few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. Today's webinar does not have interactive chat capabilities, so all attendees are muted. If you wish to comment on today's presentation using Twitter, you may use the hashtag you see on the screen. We're not going to be monitoring the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for Rebecca, please type them into the question box on your screen, and Rebecca will answer them at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time, she will answer them offline and we'll send those answers to all attendees. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording, the presentation slides, and an evaluation. Please take time to fill out the evaluation form since it will be used by the committee to plan future events. And now here's Rebecca. There will be a slight delay as we switch speakers.
Hello. I want to thank you for attending this webinar. Over the past few years, I've become very interested in this topic, and I hope you'll find some useful tips that you can use in your own libraries. As Felicity told you, I'm the AD for Technical Services and Library Systems at the University at Albany, which is part of the State University of New York system. I've been in this position for almost 11 months. Before that, all of my jobs have been in cataloging. I started out at the University of Pittsburgh, filing in the card catalog. Later on, I took on cataloging, recon, and authorities work. Before coming to UAlbany, I was at Penn State, and it was while I was there that I got interested in assessment. I know several of my Penn State colleagues are listening in today, and I want to say hello to them and thank them. All of the assessment projects that I'm going to talk about today were done by librarians and staff at Penn State, and they should get the credit for the success of those projects. I'm going to talk first about what I see as the assessment landscape. I'll follow that with a short overview of my own research on this topic. I'm going to discuss the goals of assessment and then discuss 5 methods of qualitative assessment that you might find useful to try out in your libraries. The 5 methods are workflow assessment, customer surveys, focus groups, benchmarking, and cataloging reviews. The assessment landscape over the past 10 years or more has included a number of initiatives. The ACRL report on the value of academic libraries, LibQual, the ARL biennial conferences on library assessment, and the library assessment SPEC kit are geared towards assessment in academic libraries. However, the ALCTS forum and the CAMS programs were aimed at a broader audience. My interest in assessment began when I attended a Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division program in the spring of 2011 that was keynoted by Megan Oakleaf. She prepared the ACRL report on the value of academic libraries. The part of her talk that I found most interesting was when she discussed assessment. I found that most of the discussion revolved around public services, student learning, information literacy, and related issues. I had noticed that there were very few technical services librarians at the program, and it was during the question and answer period at the end of Megan's talk that I asked her about technical services assessment. Technical services contributes a lot to the research mission of the university through original cataloging and authority work, which are in themselves a contribution to the scholarly record. We also support resource sharing through copy cataloging, batch loading, and other means. The impact of technical services work goes far beyond the frontline work of answering reference questions or providing instruction. Our work is permanent. The records that we create will live forever in our shared databases. They're a permanent contribution to the scholarly record. But I saw this work being ignored by this and other efforts, and it inspired me to look more closely at the assessment activities that take place in technical services, and specifically cataloging units. Megan's report included 22 recommendations for next steps for librarians who want to demonstrate value to their communities. Many of these next steps had to do with assessment. The next two slides include some of Megan's recommendations regarding assessment. First of all, she claims that it's critical to communicate assessment results with library stakeholders. I think this is a good point because we don't do enough of this in technical services. Another recommendation had to do with evidence-based decision-making. This is a trend that has come out of the medical field. I think we've been doing this in technical services without calling it evidence-based decision-making, but I think it's worthwhile for us to look at this literature to see what we can take from it. Another recommendation had to do with creating confidence in library assessment efforts. Again, this can be applied to cataloging. When we conduct regular assessment and make improvements based on the results of those assessment efforts, we increase our own confidence as well as the confidence of the participants and the administration. Another recommendation was to appoint dedicated assessment personnel. This is almost impossible except for the largest of libraries, but what we can do is create a culture of assessment so that everyone is encouraged to think creatively about what we do. Megan made this point about fostering environments to enable creativity and risk-taking. She encourages us to integrate library assessment into planning efforts and to make sure that we support assessment efforts through adequate resources. This can include funding for a facilitator or professional development, or simply taking time out of the day to work on assessment projects. Many of these themes address recommendations that we'll be talking about today. I'm sure that many of you have heard about LibQual, and you may have even participated in the survey itself. In my last position, I served on a committee that carried out the LibQual survey. I found the overall experience to be really interesting and valuable to me personally. The LibQual survey instrument compares users' perceptions of our services with what they expect to get from us. It provides a lot of statistics and graphs that demonstrates how close we are to meeting users' expectations. And when the survey is conducted regularly over a period of years, it can show trends. This survey also allows respondents to write in comments, and I found those comments to be the most interesting part of the survey results. We coded the comments and used them to identify service issues that we need to address. LibQual goals are listed on this slide. This is right from their website. The LibQual is intended to foster a culture of excellence in providing library service. It is intended to help libraries better understand user perceptions of the library service quality, to collect and interpret library user feedback over time, and to provide libraries with comparable assessment information from peer institutions. It's also intended to identify best practices in library service and to enhance library staff members' analytical skills for interpreting and acting on data. These are all worthwhile goals. What I was struck by in my own experience with LibQual is that, again, it's primarily focused on public services activities and library space. Technical services contributions to the work of the libraries is overlooked. Another assessment initiative is also sponsored by the Association of Research Libraries. They've held a biennial conference on assessment since 2006, and I was lucky enough to attend the 2012 conference, which was incredibly interesting to me. One thing I noticed was that there were no programs or presentations on the assessment of technical services activities. I looked at every single poster session too, but I still found no programs on our work. Since then, I've reviewed every conference proceeding since 2006 and found nothing on technical services. Again, it's clear to some extent our activities are not viewed in the same light as other library activities, and I think this area is ripe for us to explore through our research and other efforts. ARL also has published a SPEC kit on the topic of library assessment in 2007. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with SPEC kits, but for those of you who aren't, they're publications that combine the results of a survey as well as documentation on a topic of interest to the ARL membership. ARL conducts and publishes 6 SPEC surveys each year. The 2007 SPEC kit on library assessment did in fact address the assessment of cataloging to a small degree in the context of this question. Please indicate which of the following departments or units your library has assessed since 2002 and what methodologies were used for those assessments. The question listed a number of library departments, including cataloging. 62 libraries responded to the part about cataloging, and they reported that they had conducted the following types of assessment: surveys, qualitative methods, statistics collection and analysis, usability, and other. As you can see, 76% of libraries conducted some form of assessment of cataloging, but the majority of that, 69%, involved the collection and analysis of statistics. In case you're curious about what the other category included, it was defined in an earlier question as benchmarking, unit cost analyses, balanced scorecard, and process improvement. Another recent initiative on assessment was the ALCTS Forum on Technical Services Statistics and Assessment, which was held in 2012. This forum focused on the collection and use of statistics, and the discussion covered issues such as what statistics are collected, the difficulty of using automated systems to collect statistics, the reasons why they're collected, and how librarians make use of and report the statistics that they collect and maintain. The issues they addressed included what statistics are collected by technical services and how are they collected, the differences between collecting statistics and providing meaningful reports, how do technical services utilize statistics to assess the effectiveness of their operations, and what benchmarks are used to define success, and how do technical services operations factor into efforts to define the value of the library to the parent organization or community. You can see that that last point points back towards that Value of Academic Libraries report that ACRL published. The forum is archived on the ALCTS website, and the link is in the list of resources. I forgot to mention, I'm going to be distributing a list of resources after the webinar. You'll be sent this list. It's about 2 pages of resources that I'm citing in this webinar, and the things that I think you might find useful. The CAMS had a cataloging interest group also sponsored a number of programs in 2011 and 2012 on the topic of assessment. These included Assessment 101, presented by Joyce Chapman, and a program that was intended to present actual assessment projects. It included a session on quantitative assessment by Casey Cheney and a much shorter version of this presentation that I gave in January. All of these presentations are archived on the CAMS Heads of Cataloging Interest Group space in ALA Connect, and I encourage you to take a look at them. After attending the PALA workshop on assessment in 2011, I asked to serve on the Library Assessment and Metrics Council at my library at Penn State. My goal was to learn more about what we were doing to assess our work. One of the projects of that group was to prepare a workshop on assessment for supervisors and managers within the libraries, and I did a short presentation on assessment activities that had been done in the cataloging department. Those slides were the core of what I would later present at ALA and are part of this webinar as well. Another project that the group worked on was a survey to evaluate all of the departments in the library. It was to be done in phases. For example, the first round included departments that provided support for all of the other departments, like the business office, facilities, IT, HR, and others. And the next round was supposed to include operational units like acquisitions, serials, cataloging, and preservation. After I read the Academic Libraries report, I began to wonder how other libraries evaluated technical services activities. I decided to do a survey of Pennsylvania academic libraries as a way to test the waters and see what folks were doing. I was also hoping to present the results at a future PALA or ALA conference, which I did. The goal of the survey was to determine what assessment activities were taking place in technical services, who was responsible for conducting assessment, what their goals were, what actions they took as a result of their assessment activities, and how they shared the results. I sent the survey out to 120 Pennsylvania academic libraries and got responses from 63, a 57% response rate. I found that their methods of assessment included gathering statistics, gathering input from non-technical services staff, conducting customer service surveys, benchmarking, the use of a suggestion box, and focus groups. As you can see, gathering statistics was the most heavily used form of assessment, with 84% of the libraries reporting that. This survey addressed all of the technical services, not just cataloging, but I did ask what departments were assessed and found that 57% of the libraries assessed both cataloging and acquisitions, 45% assessed electronic resources management, and 26% evaluated preservation units. A paper resulting from that survey is going to be published in the April 2014 issue of LIRTS, in case you're interested in reading about more of the results. This year, along with my colleague Nancy Pullman, I conducted a survey on the use of benchmarking as an assessment tool for cataloging. The survey was distributed on AutoCAD and generated 92 completed surveys. Of those 92 libraries, only 20 had conducted any sort of benchmarking. This is consistent with the results of my earlier study in technical services, which found that 19% of academic libraries had used benchmarking to assess technical services activities. When asked whether they plan to use benchmarking again in the next 5 years, 10 libraries responded to that question, 9 of them indicating that they plan to use benchmarking again. Now I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about why we do assessment. The Value of Academic Libraries report encouraged us to do assessment so that we could demonstrate the contributions that libraries make to our communities, but there are a lot of other reasons for conducting assessment as well. The goals of assessment activities in technical services and cataloging include many possibilities, and they vary from one situation to another. In many ways, they're dependent on the individual library's needs and interests at any given time. Even within one institution, they can vary from year to year. In both of the surveys that I conducted on assessment, by far the most important reason reported for conducting assessment was to improve processes and increase the effectiveness of the unit. Assessment can also be conducted to help managers and administrators make better decisions. Better decisions are made when they're based on useful information. For example, if you learn through your assessment activities that your customers value one service over another, that information can help you make a decision about your priorities. Assessment activities can also be used to identify ways to reduce costs. You might want to evaluate 2 or more vendor services to identify the most cost-effective one. Using a vendor for some services is another way to reduce costs. In my library at UAlbany, we've been managing our electronic resources, records, and holdings manually, a process that takes 1 full-time staff member. We assessed this workflow and are now in the process of implementing a MARC record service for a fraction of the cost of a full-time person, freeing up staff time to devote to other things that we haven't had time to do, in this case authority work. As our workflows change, we may have to give employees different responsibilities or assign them additional or different tasks. For example, as many libraries purchase fewer print books, staff who print and apply labels may be assigned different work. Again, my previous example shows how an assessment project resulted in the reassignment of responsibilities. Assessment can also help to identify services or activities that can be eliminated. Periodic reviews of workflows or procedures can help identify steps or activities that are no longer necessary. I have found that new staff often innocently question a procedure, and that can generate a review that leads to a better process. It's easy to become complacent, but as our environment changes, our procedures should be reviewed regularly to identify situations like these. Strategic planning is improved by good information that results from assessment activities that might note trends in collection development or other areas that will affect your cataloging unit. Noting changes in programs, curricula, demographics, technology, and other areas through your assessment activities can help inform the direction that you go in the future. Learning important trends through assessment can help you prepare for change, even if it's not imminent. Finally, I believe that assessment activities can help you to communicate not only within your own unit, but also with customers and your administration. Some assessment activities can almost serve as a public relations tool with your customers. For example, by conducting a customer service survey, you're communicating to your customers that you care about their opinions and feedback. Assessment can also help you communicate with your administration. By sharing the results of your assessment activities, you might be able to show that your customers are satisfied with your work or identify areas that need additional resources or staff. Much of the assessment literature addresses quantitative measures. I'm more interested in qualitative assessment and have developed this webinar to review a number of qualitative assessment techniques. I've either led or participated in each of these activities, most of them during my previous position as head of cataloging at Penn State. I'm going to focus on the 5 assessment methods that are listed on this slide: workflow assessment, customer surveys, interviews and focus groups, quality assessment, and benchmarking. Workflow analysis and assessment is the most commonly reported forms of assessment in the library literature. When I was preparing the literature review for my LIRCS article, I found a number of such studies. Some of the papers that specifically addressed cataloging were assessments of workflow across all of technical services or between acquisitions and cataloging, workflow assessment and redesign, assessment of specific activities such as database maintenance, and assessment of specific services such as shelf-ready processing. I've put citations for a number of articles that address workflow in cataloging and across technical services in the list of resources that you'll receive after the webinar. I've also listed a couple of books that I found particularly useful as well. Penn State invested heavily in the CQI model in the early 1990s. CQI stands for Continuous Quality Improvement and is defined as a process of creating an environment in which management and workers strive to create constantly improving quality. It encourages everyone involved with the process to always be open to and think about ways to improve the process. Penn State's Office of Planning and Institutional Assessment provides many resources to support CQI projects across the university. According to Penn State's model, there are 5 steps to the CQI process. The steps include identifying the current situation, forecasting future trends, and identifying stakeholders, reviewing your mission and goals, identifying performance indicators, identifying gaps between where we are and where we want to be, and targeting key processes for improvement, developing action plans to close the gaps, and implementing those action plans. There are a number of factors that are necessary for a CQI team to be successful. First of all, they need a clear process. Without that, it's too easy for a team to get bogged down in details and uncertainty about what to do next. Secondly, CQI teams need a sponsor. Someone or someones at the administrative level has to support this effort. Funding may be needed for meeting rooms or food and drink for longer meetings. Support needs to be given for the time to invest in meetings, discussions, and the team's work. Even if a team has regularly scheduled meetings, work has to be done outside of those meetings, and that has to be accounted for and approved. Sponsors make that happen. Each team needs an administrative leader. This would ideally not be someone who supervises the team members, but someone who is respected and knowledgeable about the project. Finally, each team needs a facilitator. An outside facilitator is ideal because he or she can ask questions without any preconceived notions, and this is less threatening to team members than when someone from inside the organization is questioning how things work. At Penn State, we used the FastTrack CQI approach, which is documented at this URL. This allowed us to approach a problem or a workflow and address it in a matter of weeks rather than months. I have found that the CQI approach is especially useful when a number of conditions exist. First of all, when you're assessing a workflow that crosses organizational units with different supervisors. A CQI team that includes stakeholders from multiple departments will be able to address the competing priorities of those units. The CQI approach is also useful when you're assessing a complex workflow. By including representatives from all units involved and a neutral facilitator, you're more likely to come to a balanced conclusion that is not biased towards one unit over another. A CQI approach is also useful when you're assessing a workflow that has been in place for too long. In these situations, participants are invested in the current state of affairs and might have difficulty seeing the value of other approaches. The CQI approach, by considering all viewpoints as objectively as possible, can be less threatening in these cases. CQI is also useful when there are differences of opinion about how to or whether to change a workflow. By working through all the possibilities in an objective way, participants can come to a solution themselves, rather than just having someone else decide for them. In these situations, people are more likely to buy into a change in procedure or responsibility. The CQI process starts when the efficiency or effectiveness of a process is questioned. At this point, it's helpful to put together a list of questions or issues that need to be assessed. This can include issues like, can this step be eliminated? How can we avoid handoffs? And so on. It's essential to include all stakeholders in this process, including the people who are actually doing the work that is being assessed. Usually these are the folks that are the most knowledgeable about a process, and they may have a long institutional memory for why things are done a certain way. The CQI process often starts with a kickoff meeting in which the sponsor or sponsors meet with the team and the facilitator to give them their charge and answer any questions about what the goals are. Afterwards, the team will set up a meeting schedule and agree on ground rules for the meetings. In the FastTrack approach, the teams only met for 4 two-hour meetings, about 2 weeks apart. The first thing the group has to do is to make sure there's a thorough understanding of the current process. They might develop flowcharts and review current documentation. This is when having an outside facilitator can be especially helpful because they can ask questions without making anyone defensive. If a supervisor or someone invested in the current process questions something, it can make participants defensive or nervous. But if an outsider does this, it's just because they don't understand, and participants can explain things to them without any defensiveness. The next step is to identify areas for improvement. Sometimes these are suggested by the charge or the list of questions or issues that the group has been asked to consider. Other ideas might come through brainstorming sessions. The group works through all of these ideas and comes up with suggestions for improvement and reports back to their sponsors. It's important to follow up after a period of time, 3 or 6 months for example, to determine what actions have been taken as a result of the team's work. When I was head of cataloging at Penn State, I was lucky enough to co-sponsor 2 CQI teams. The first team assessed the workflow between 3 departments: acquisitions, cataloging, and the Media Technology Support Services Department, which we called Media Tech. Media Tech was responsible for maintaining all of the technology classrooms across campus, and they also had a large film collection that not only was used for classroom purposes, but also was available to non-university patrons as a rental collection. Materials for this collection were ordered and cataloged in our ILS, but they were also cataloged and circulated from another system called MediaNet, which at the time had superior booking capabilities. Our workflow for this material was that acquisitions would order, receive, and pay for items. Then they would be sent to MediaTek to be cataloged in MediaNet. Then information would be sent back to cataloging in a Word document for us to complete the cataloging in the ILS. This workflow had been in place for a long time, perhaps from a time when there were cataloging backlogs. But times had changed and we didn't have backlogs anymore and wanted to change the workflow so that cataloging received the item before it was sent to MediaTek. There was some resistance to this change, so the head of MediaTek and I co-sponsored a CQI team to review and possibly revise this workflow. The overarching goal was to reduce processing time and to increase efficiencies. If you're interested in reading more about the work of this team, the team leader, Rob Freeborn, co-authored a paper about it. The citations listed in the resources document that I'm sharing after the webinar. The second opportunity that I had to co-sponsor a CQI team involved government documents processing. In 2007, Penn State Libraries Administration decided to reorganize government documents processing and placed the responsibility in technical services for the first time. Management for receiving government documents would take place in the Serials and Acquisitions Services Department, and responsibility for cataloging them would take place in Cataloging and Metadata Services. This responsibility was new for me, as I'd never been responsible for government documents before, and we had a lot of questions about workflow and procedures. Further complicating things was the fact that we had to comply with federal regulations regarding government documents processing, which I wasn't familiar with. The government documents librarian and I, with the help of everyone involved, came up with a long list of questions and issues that we wanted to investigate. We decided to co-sponsor a CQI team to assess the workflow and these other issues. This effort included stakeholders from 3 departments: Cataloging, Serials and Acquisitions, and the Social Sciences Library, and assessed workflows not only for the U.S. government documents, but also state, UN, Canadian, and European Union documents. In both of the CQI efforts in which I've been involved, there were a number of benefits and positive outcomes. In both cases, we were able to streamline the processes that were under review. We gained efficiencies and decreased the time it took to get something from the acquisitions or receipt stage to the shelf. We also gained a better understanding of the overall workflow on the part of everyone involved. People learned what everyone else in the workflow was responsible for. We were also able to generate improved documentation as a result of these efforts, including flowcharts and written documentation. Finally, we gained greater confidence in the resulting workflow itself. As I mentioned earlier, workflow assessment is commonly reported in the library literature. It can be a valuable assessment tool for cataloging managers. The examples that I shared involved an outside facilitator, which is not going to be available to everyone. There are certainly benefits to having a facilitator, but I believe that it's entirely possible to conduct similar projects without one. Another form of assessment that could be very useful for cataloging managers is to conduct customer survey. I use the term customer to mean any person or unit that is in some way dependent on the work that cataloging staff do. At Penn State, we conducted a customer service survey in 2011. I appointed a team to develop and conduct the survey and write up the results in a report. The team included librarians and staff from each team in the department. For this project, we defined customers as the subject and branch librarians and libraries. If you were to conduct a similar survey, you could just as easily broaden the definition to mean anyone who depends on cataloging for any reason. It could just as easily include acquisitions, preservation, digital initiatives, and other departments. When planning the survey, we decided not to make the survey anonymous, and we asked for one response from each subject or branch library. We did that so that we could make specific changes if our service to a particular library was in any way deficient. Again, this is something that could just as easily have gone the other way. It really depends on your circumstances. Since this wasn't anonymous, we asked the respondents to tell us which library or branch they were at. We asked them to tell us what services we provided, as this varied a little bit from one campus to another. We asked them to tell us how happy they were with the speed and quality of our services, as well as the speed of response to reported problems. And we asked them to provide descriptions of specific experiences in detail. The next couple of questions addressed issues related to communication. Did they know whom to contact if they had a problem? Did they feel comfortable asking for help? And could they find needed information on our website? Finally, are there services that we don't currently provide but wish they would like us to? There are a number of benefits of customer surveys. The most obvious one is that they can tell you something that you don't know. Through a survey, you can become aware of any dissatisfactions or, conversely, the things that your customers are very happy with. They can also corroborate something that you might suspect is true. I'm planning to survey librarians and staff here at UAlbany on technical services and library systems activities, and I already have an idea of some of their concerns. I'm hoping that the survey will help us gauge the extent of the concerns and give us some guidance as to what improvements they would like to see. Surveys also demonstrate to your customers that you care what they think and that you're open to their opinions. Of course, that means that there have to be some outcomes to the survey, and the results and outcomes need to be shared with your customers. Sharing the survey results in a report or another way can serve as a public relations tool. Again, this is tied to perceptions of your department. If through your survey and other assessment activities you show that you're open to suggestions and you'll take them seriously, it will go a long way towards strengthening your relationships with other units. Finally, surveys can be used to support change, request funding, or pursue further assessment efforts. So I never conducted formal focus groups. However, I did hold several rounds of formal meetings with small groups across the libraries, representing each subject library. On the main campus at Penn State, there were about a dozen subject-based libraries. I did one round of meetings in 2009 and 2010 and a second round in 2012. I first asked the head of each library if they were interested in meeting with me, and all of the libraries except for engineering agreed. I asked each library to invite any or all of the librarians and staff in their libraries to the meeting, and I was really pleased that they appeared to invite everybody in their units. For each of these meetings, I had prepared a series of questions and updates that I thought they might be interested in, and I shared that with them ahead of time. I also invited them to bring any issues that they had to the meeting. The issues on this slide represent the questions from the 2012 round of meetings. They included an update on RDA implementation, feedback on current projects specific to the group that I was speaking with, questions about new projects they wanted to propose, and clarifying policies, procedures, and workflow. I also asked if they had any issues, problems, or concerns, and whether they needed help getting cataloging statistics from our ILS's statistics module. Any other questions that they had were fair game. After each meeting, I summarized the meeting and shared it with the cataloging department and responded to any other questions that I didn't know the answer to during the meeting. I found it interesting that each library had different concerns and questions, even though the services that we supplied to them were very similar. Some libraries were very interested in starting special cataloging projects. Others had no interest in that. Their needs varied considerably from one library to the next. There was an interesting study published in 2004 on the use of focus groups to assess cataloging. The authors reported on an assessment effort at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in which they conducted focus groups to gauge the perception of cataloging services. They asked 7 questions that addressed communication, web page functionality, speed, and quality of service, and which sought feedback on the services that cataloging supplied to them. They identified a number of themes in the responses, one of which was that their customers were not sure whom to contact when faced with a cataloging problem. The focus group effort has helped them to make changes to be more effective and communicate better with their customers. Another form of assessment that managers might find useful is to conduct periodic quality reviews of cataloging and other processes. When catalogers of different generations work together, it's quite possible that their training varied considerably from one decade to the next. Given the rapid change that we all face in cataloging, it's quite possible that catalogers, even within the same office, follow different procedures and practices. At Penn State, we began to conduct annual cataloging reviews about 10 years ago. The cataloging department was organized into 5 and later 6 format-based cataloging and processing teams. Each team developed its own process. The only thing that I asked was that they write a short report, just a few paragraphs or a page, identifying what the process was and whether the cataloging review brought to light any training needs or policy issues that needed to be discussed. I also asked them to report about whether they found the process valuable. Each team came up with a process each year. This was in their hands and could change from year to year. For example, the music AV cataloging team might require each team member to select 3 items, a DVD, a CD, and a kit, that they would each catalog the item, original or copy depending on their responsibilities, share the records with each other, and then meet to discuss. This allowed them to ask each other questions about cataloging decisions they made and to clarify when there was confusion about a particular policy issue. I'm not going to go through the other examples on this slide, but you can see that there can be many different approaches to a review like this. Overall, the catalogers reported that they found the review process helpful. It wasn't just an exercise that we did every year. Before I worked at Penn State, I worked as a cataloging management librarian at Yale University. One of my jobs there was to train staff to do retrospective conversion. These were folks who had worked primarily with print catalogs, and they had been retrained to do recon work. We revised their work for many months, and then we decided to conduct a quality assurance test to see how they were doing. We compiled a list of the most common errors and sorted them into what we considered major and minor errors. Major ones included anything that affected access in the online catalog, such as a typo in a heading or a title, miscoding the mark tags because that would cause an entry to file in the wrong index, or errors in the location or call number. We kept track of everyone's work for a period of time and used the results to make decisions about whom to release from revision. Although we only used this assessment tool during the training process, it could easily be implemented on a yearly basis or if problems are noted throughout the year. I believe that there are a number of benefits to this type of process. For example, cataloging reviews ensures that everyone is on the same page as far as policies and procedures are concerned. It can help identify training needs. It can be a team-building exercise for the catalogers involved, where they can have open discussions about cataloging choices. It can encourage catalogers to question each other in a non-intimidating way. It's also a good management practice, the results of which can be shared with the administration. It builds confidence in the department as a whole. Another useful tool for assessment is benchmarking. When researching the practice of benchmarking for the survey project that I mentioned earlier, I found a lot of definitions. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm defining benchmarking as the process of comparing one's own policies, procedures, or other factors, like statistics, to other institutions for evaluative purposes or to determine best practices. Many resources that I consulted focused on statistical benchmarks. Michelle Charbonneau conducted an Indiana University study on production benchmarks for catalogers, which was published in LIRTS in 2005. She found that defining production benchmarks across the board for cataloging doesn't work very well. She found that, she wrote, the product catalogers create is highly specialized and cannot be quantified in a manner analogous to mechanized-based measurements. However, my search has found that it is possible and useful to benchmark against other institutions to determine best practices and to develop efficient procedures. Along with a colleague, I recently conducted a survey on AutoCAD on the use of benchmarking as an assessment tool for cataloging. The respondents indicated that benchmarking was used to evaluate processes with the goal of streamlining them. Other goals for benchmarking included making better decisions, improving services, reallocating staff or other resources, and informing strategic planning activities. I want to focus on what I think are the three biggest advantages to benchmarking. First of all, information learned through benchmarking activities can be used to improve performance. Other institutions might have more efficient procedures or more effective policies. Learning how others do things can help you look at your own policies and procedures in a new way. That doesn't mean that everyone else is doing it right and you're doing it wrong, only that the differences can be useful in changing your mindset. A second advantage to benchmarking is that it generates ideas. The more examples you consider, the more possibilities you will see. The third benefit of benchmarking is that it encourages a continuous improvement mindset. Benchmarking can be a formal process or it can be as informal as writing a question on AutoCAD. Both approaches have merit, but the main point is to always be evaluating our processes with an eye towards greater efficiency or effectiveness. The biggest disadvantage to benchmarking in our environment is comparing apples to oranges. Original cataloging at one institution might be defined differently than original cataloging at another institution. Cataloging a music CD might take 4 times as long as cataloging the latest bestseller. It's difficult to come up with one across-the-board metric for everything. Another big disadvantage is coming up with a valid peer group. If you're a member of a consortium of similar libraries, you might be able to use that group as a peer group. The Association of Research Libraries serves such a role for many libraries. But even ARL has a wide disparity among institutions. The libraries at the top of the list are very different creatures from those near the bottom of the list. Before I conclude, I want to say that it's important to assess your assessment activities. Not every evaluation or assessment project will give you useful information, and that's okay. It's important to review whether you got the information you needed, and if not, to develop another approach the next time. Finally, it's important to document and share the results of your project. Publication of case studies helps others who want to do similar projects later. Sharing the results internally through newsletters and other venues is good PR for your department. Even if you find that you need to make changes, it's good to share that too. It demonstrates that you care what your customers think and that you're committed to making improvements. I believe there's a need for further research on this topic. I would like to see studies or papers on different methods of assessment. I also appreciate reading case studies. They're always useful to me when I'm starting my own project. It would also be interesting to see whether and how assessment takes place in different types of libraries, public and academic, large and small, and so on. Finally, I'd like to see more presentations on this topic at conferences. It would be great to come up with qualitative benchmarks that libraries could use to evaluate their own departments. A technical services assessment toolkit would also be very helpful. There are many ways that we can conduct meaningful assessment of cataloging activities. Through workflow assessment, surveys, focus groups, benchmarking, and other forms of evaluation, we can learn about the needs of our customers and make improvements to our processes that ensure that we're producing quality, timely products that support those needs. I want to thank you for your time today. My contact information is on the last slide, and I would be happy to hear from anyone who has questions or comments later. At this point, I believe we have about 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. We do have some questions that have come in. And if others have questions or comments, please submit them via the question box. So here's the first question. Isn't another reason for assessment simply because we are required to, for accreditation purposes, for the institution, especially for an academic library?
Yes, I agree. That was reported by a number of libraries that they're required to do certain amounts or certain kinds of assessment for accreditation. A lot of that I think has to do with statistics, and so I didn't focus on that very much in today's webinar because I was more interested in the qualitative types of assessment that helps us improve processes. But yes, that was definitely reported in both of the studies that I did.
Okay. And for the purposes here, are you describing assessment more as redesign than evaluation?
Redesign, does that mean?
Of your work, I think.
I think I'm thinking of assessment as evaluating or assessing the work itself as a way to know whether you need to redesign it. You could assess your workflow and find out that it's perfectly fine. Or you could assess it and find out that you can eliminate 3 steps, or you could assess it and find out that you're not doing something that you should be doing by law or for some other reason. So assessing it is, comes before redesign, I think.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the culture of assessment and how did you create that at Penn State in your department?
Well, I think that, I just really got interested in assessment in the last couple of years. But I think that the culture of assessment really began in the early 90s when Penn State went towards the continuous quality improvement model. In the early 90s, and this is long before I started working there, they formed a lot of support services that would help units all across the university to conduct CQI assessments. And some of the assessments early on took a long time, and they were very time consuming. And then they developed this FastTrack approach, which was actually much quicker. And you could look at small workflows or discrete workflows and assess them using the FastTrack approach. So I would say before I got to Penn State, the culture was already in place. And over the years, we were asked to take on a number of these things. And just to clarify, all of these things weren't my idea. In fact, some of them, like the annual cataloging reviews, I wasn't overly enthusiastic about it in the beginning, but I was completely won over after we went through a couple of rounds of it and people found it really useful. So sometimes you're asked to take things on like this, and when you do, you find out it's really valuable. And I think that happened in a couple of places, or a couple of the situations there.
Okay. Do you have any suggestions for assessment of a small university library? For instance, a staff of 1 in cataloging, 1 in acquisitions, 1 in ILL, 1 in electronic resources management.
Well, I think that assessment doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have to start with something that you're concerned about. Or if you're just concerned about, are we doing things right, I would start by reading the literature and getting some ideas about how other libraries do things, and then take that back and work with your colleagues to decide whether you want to approach it or you want to start an assessment project based on that. So it's, even small libraries, I think, can address their workflow, and sometimes the workflows, because I noticed in my own institution it's a lot smaller than Penn State was, and the workflows are very entrenched because there's fewer people actually looking at the processes and thinking about them. So I think you really just need to start with a problem, look at the literature, and try to generate some ideas about what you want to look at.
Okay. Do you know of any assessments of the quality or usability of output from a library user viewpoint, students, faculty, etc.?
No, I haven't seen that. And what I think it would be really interesting is somehow assessing output like original cataloging and authority control. And I don't know how to do that yet, but I think that there's a lot of room for research in this area. What is the impact of our original cataloging? It's hard to measure it because once you do an original cataloging record, that exists forever, and sometimes, the impact accrues over time.
I think you've answered this next one, but let me read this. Have you conducted or do you know of studies to assess particular mark fields to determine the level of effort that's appropriate? So do individuals value the work put into subjects versus keyword?
OCLC did a study a couple of years ago where they were evaluating, I don't know if they went mark field by mark field, but they did come, some of their major findings were that users really valued things that helped them make decisions about whether they were interested in a book or another item by looking at the cataloging records. So users really appreciated subject headings, and they really appreciated contents notes and summary notes. I can't remember the name of that report.
Okay. You mentioned the advantages of the CQI model. Were there limitations or deficiencies that you experienced?
Oh, I don't know. I can't, nothing really jumped out at me. And since I only used that model twice, that's all I have to really base it on, and I don't have anything to compare it against. I think there's probably other models too for doing this kind of work, and they probably all have good points and bad points, but there's nothing that really jumps out at me.
Okay. Did you find that having teams sharing items cataloged and providing each other feedback worked as well for support staff as for cataloging librarians? And also, when you have teams share each other's records, were supervisors present at the meetings?
Well, at Penn State, the department was organized into 6 self-directed work teams. So there was only one supervisor for the whole department. And the librarians that were on each respective team really were colleagues with the staff that were on the teams. They all worked together. So there was already an element of collegiality that existed, and so I didn't see that there was a problem with that, or even a difference between staff and librarians having those discussions.
Okay. Here's a question about a project you mentioned. What was the outcome of your reorganization of government documents? And have you written about that?
No, I wanted to, but I never did. 2 staff members were moved to technical services to manage those processes, so they were both moved into cataloging. One was the serials, the person who handled all the serials, and the other person was the one who handled all the monographs. And they were incredible additions to the department, and they took on other work as well in addition to the government documents. The results of the project themselves, there were a lot of changes made to documentation, and I think we clarified some things and we eliminated some steps, and I don't have all that with me right now, so I can't provide the details, like the very minute details about the project. But we made a number of recommendations. You know, one of the issues that we managed to get on the list had to do with how government documents were handled in the online catalog. That wasn't really a process improvement, but it was related, and we were able to make changes to that as well.
Okay. Here's one about the broader impact of what we do. What are some ways that an academic library assesses how its cataloging is improving student success for accreditation purposes in measurable ways? So at this institution, they're trying to evaluate how cataloging is helping students succeed in learning in the program. Would you suggest surveys, or are there other methods?
Oh, I don't know. That's a hard one. I think that that's a great area for research. I don't know. I think I'm stumped on that one.
Okay. That does pull out data in different ways, doesn't it?
Yeah. The value of academic libraries report suggested that libraries try to do studies and assessment that prove, like, how do libraries help recruit faculty? How do they help retain faculty? How do they help with student retention? There's a lot of possibilities for research in those areas. I don't know how you would do that, show how cataloging helps student learning or retention.
Okay. How do you bring administration on board?
Well, I just think you have to communicate with them as much as possible. Do an assessment project, share your results, show how they've made improvements in your work or the perceptions of your users, or whatever it is that you're trying to address. I think you have to have some successes to show them and get their support.
You mentioned benchmarking. What were you benchmarking?
Oh, over the years, Penn State is a member of the CIC, which is the academic arm of the Big Ten consortium, and I can't even tell you how many times over the years one of my bosses said, benchmark that against the CIC, and I would send an email off to the CIC libraries and ask them how they do this, how do they do something, whatever it is, and it was really interesting. Sometimes I would, this is where benchmarking against a peer group is really dangerous, because your boss could say something like, like Illinois does this whole activity with nothing but students, or I could say, Indiana has 10 people that do this activity and we only have 3, and really neither one of those are valid, because all of our institutions, even though we're in the same consortium, we're very different organisms. So with benchmarking, it's really important to have a good peer group.
Okay, great. Let me slip in one last question here. How have e-resources affected cataloging assessment?
I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that, I don't think. managing of electronic resources is something that you might want to assess. Who does it, how it's done, what the workflow is. We just went through a process where we were evaluating how we're managing our e-resources. So I don't know how e-resources affects assessment, but e-resources is something that definitely needs to be assessed.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. And we're out of time for the questions. I want to thank you, Rebecca, for sharing that information.
Thank you. I really appreciate being given the opportunity to present here.
Great. And so we trust you found today's session useful. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. We ask that you please take a few minutes to respond to the questions because the Continuing Education Committee is looking at those as we develop webinars. And we're planning our spring 2014 webinars now. So upcoming in December, we have 3 webinars. Floating collections, MOOCs, our last in a series of 4. It's been very popular. And then on December 18th, accessible electronic resources for all. We also have coming up an e-forum on fast subject headings, and that's on December 18th. So December 11th that starts. So you will find all of this information on the ALCTS website, and you will be getting an email with a link to the presentation slides, and the evaluation form, plus the ALCTS email address where you can find more information. So thank you all for attending, and we hope you will participate in other ALCTS offerings coming up soon. Goodbye.